Hello, everyone out there. My name is Gregory Gause. I teach political science at the University of Vermont. My specialties are Middle East politics and international relations. And it's a pleasure to be on bloggingheads.tv.
Yeah, great. It's a pleasure to finally meet you, albeit virtually. My name is Shadi Hamid. I'm the Director of Research at the Brookings Doha Center and a Fellow at the Saban Center for Middle East Policy at Brookings in Washington. And my focus is on Islamist political parties and democratization in the Middle East.
Just to tee up this conversation, the folks at Blogging Heads asked Shadi and me to be on here because we both have worked on the issue of democratization and have written about American policy and democracy promotion in the Arab world specifically. And we're here to talk about that and democratization in the larger Muslim world as well, and American policy toward that. Although specifically, we're both our expertise is both in the Arab world. Just to tee this up a little bit, about 5 years ago, I wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs that criticized the Bush administration's democracy promotion policies in the Arab world. I didn't see any relationship between terrorism and democracy. I didn't see that in the social science literature. And I thought that democracy promotion would probably bring to power governments in the Arab world that no one in Washington would much like. And there's been a good debate about that. Shadi and a co-author of his, Stephen Brooks, had a very nice piece in Policy Review, I guess about a year ago, maybe 18 months ago, that took me on that, and there's been a lot of other people who thought I was full of it. So it's nice to engage in a dialogue with Shadi and to meet you virtually as well.
Yeah, great to meet you as well, Greg. And yes, I mean, I think your piece in Foreign Affairs a few years back was really one of the definitive articles that really put this argument forward that, yeah, fine, we can promote democracy in the Middle East, but we shouldn't be under the illusion that that's going to put a dent in terrorist activity. But I think what you just said a second ago, I actually agree with you that if there were free and fair elections in the Arab world today, in most of these countries, groups or parties that we don't like a lot would probably come to power. And by that, I'm talking primarily about Islamist parties, such as the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and similar groups. So I think you're right that Islamist groups probably would come to power in a lot of these countries, and I think we really have to ask ourselves some difficult questions here. If we're really sincere about democracy and we believe in that and we consider ourselves Democrats, then we also have to accept the fact that groups that we don't like might come to power. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, as long as they fulfill two conditions, renouncing violence and committing to participating in the democratic process, I think we have to respect the right of those groups to participate.
Well, I certainly agree that if you're going to have a democracy, you can't have a democracy that, by definition, excludes one of the largest political groups in the polity. And we certainly know in the Arab world, and I think in the broader Muslim world in most cases, Islamist groups and parties are a major part of the polity. They represent, I don't know if they represent a majority in places, but they certainly represent a plurality, I think, in the politics of a lot of these places. And so it would be foolish to say that you can have a democracy but the Islamists aren't in. I do think that this issue about the renunciation of violence is a really tricky one, because when you get groups like Hamas, like Hezbollah, like a number of the political groupings in Iraq, you have groups that on the one hand are engaged in the political process and doing the kinds of things that any political party would do, and in many cases doing them better, mobilizing people, providing services, organizing their supporters. But on the other hand, they keep either a direct or an indirect link to armed militias, because in their context, whether it be Palestine, Lebanon, Iraq, it's not simply the votes of the voters that determine policy. And so, that I think we certainly see with Hezbollah a real reluctance to give up their arms, to the extent that they kind of bend over backwards to make up excuses that the Israelis are still occupying some small parts of Lebanon and stuff like that. And so that I think is a real tough one for groups like Hamas and Hezbollah. Obviously not as tough for the Muslim Brotherhood groups in Jordan and Egypt.
Yeah, so I think there's an important distinction to make there. And I think it's very challenging from a policy standpoint to kind of figure out what to do about groups like Hamas and Hezbollah, precisely because they haven't renounced violence. But that's why I think we really have an opportunity here from an American perspective to at least engage with groups that are nonviolent and peacefully participate in the political process. And I should also mention groups like the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Jordan, or say the PJD in Morocco, have all become more moderate over time. If you look at them in the 1980s compared to the present day, these are groups that have made impressive strides on a variety of indicators, whether that's their position to democracy, pluralism, women's rights, protection of minority rights. Granted, they still have, I think, a long way to go, and they're not liberal. So, I mean, we shouldn't be under any illusion that these groups, once they come to power, are magically going to turn into perfect pro-American liberals. No, these are socially conservative parties that have a particular worldview. And, you know, we should be upfront about this. I mean, that's why they're popular in their societies, precisely because they are conservative. If they were liberals, they wouldn't be popular.
Right.
So I think, but I do think we have an opportunity here to at least open a serious dialogue and engage with these groups in a serious way,
right.
Learn more about them and have them learn more about us.
Yeah, and I certainly think, I always thought that this policy that we wouldn't talk to the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt because it would make the Mubarak government unhappy was kind of foolish. But let me press you on what I think the kind of the key American interest here is. You know, without a doubt, if say the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan or in Egypt, which I think are the two pivotal Arab states here from the point of view of American interest in democracy promotion, because they are, of course, the places we have the most leverage. If a Muslim Brotherhood government came to power in, let's say, Jordan, and basically could set the foreign policy of the place, and this is a real hypothetical because foreign policy is in the hands of the king. But let's say they could. I don't think that the American government would care that much about kind of, let's call it illiberal social legislation. Lord knows we've got a very close relationship with Saudi Arabia and a bunch of other places that have quite illiberal social atmospheres. But I think that the big thing for an American policymaker would be the position on the Arab-Israeli conflict, right? I mean, both the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Muslim Brotherhood in Jordan, as part of their official platforms, basically say, hey, we want the peace treaty with Israel abrogated. Now, if they were in power, would they do it, give up that aid, open themselves up to a possible Israeli attack with the abrogation of the treaty? You know, that's a difficult question, but certainly it would place that whole key element of American foreign policy in the Middle East and those successes of the Egyptian-Israeli and the Jordanian-Israeli peace treaty at some risk, I think.
Well, I think you're right, and there's an interesting issue here of what exactly these groups' position is towards the peace treaty. There are some leaders of the Brotherhood that, at least privately to me, have said they'd be willing to accept a two-state solution, and they sometimes get around the issue by saying they would respect past international treaties. So they'll say that kind of in a vague way, but we know what they're referring to. Or they might say that we'll put it to a referendum and let the Egyptian people decide. So I think there's actually more nuance to their position than we normally assume. And also, if there was actually a peace settlement between the Israelis and Palestinians, and somehow Hamas made peace with the idea of a two-state solution, then obviously Islamist groups in other countries would sort of have to come around to that and accept that. So there's an interesting linkage there.
Right. I've always thought that if you're really going to do a serious democracy promotion policy in the United States, it would have to be preceded by an Israeli-Palestinian settlement that basically Hamas could sign on to, because even if you had an Israeli-Palestinian settlement but one that Hamas opposed either violently or even rhetorically, that would give the signal to certainly other Muslim Brotherhood groups, and I think many other Islamist groups, that that they should oppose it as well.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's an important point, definitely. But I want to go to your your premise here, which I think is correct, is that these Islamist governments, if they actually happen, wouldn't be pro-American like the current regimes are.
Right.
They'd probably have a lot more anti-American rhetoric. They'd because these are groups that, in a very fundamental sense, don't like American policy in the region. But it should be said that the vast majority of Arabs and Muslims agree with that perspective. Right. So that's not as if it's
right.
Right. A fringe opinion.
Right. It's not just Islamists that don't like American foreign policy.
It's pretty much everyone.
It's pretty much everybody, and I think that's also an issue in terms of democracy promotion. If you're an American policymaker, you have to ask yourself, do we really want to promote democracy in areas where our policy is really quite unpopular, and eventually democratic governments kind of respond to the will of the people, even on foreign policy issues, although not perhaps as immediately on foreign policy as on domestic policy. So it's a real trade-off, I think, for Americans to think about this.
Yeah, so I think we have to balance the short term and think more with the long term and figure out what's more important to us, because you're right, there might be some short term disadvantages where we might have a situation where, let's say there's a Brotherhood Speaker of the House in Egypt, and he's going around cavorting with Ahmadinejad in Iran, and using kind of inflammatory rhetoric, and maybe isn't as and wouldn't be as excited about using Amman or Cairo as a base for CIA operations and things like that. All of those are trade-offs, and that, for example, might hurt our counterterrorism operations. But that's certainly true in the short run. But I think we have to have a longer-term view towards our interests in the region, because it's clear that what we've been doing hasn't been working. I mean, the Middle East is an absolute mess. We're talking about governments that are, in most instances, illegitimate. They don't have a lot of cachet with their own citizens. And you have situations where these are essentially failing states. And I actually remember Larry Diamond once, he was giving a talk, and I think he put this very well. He said, when he was in Egypt recently, Cairo was literally crumbling. Yeah. And that's a very good way of describing. I mean,
I have to say, I was a student back in Cairo in the early '80s, and I went back a couple of years ago, and I was actually quite surprised that it hadn't gotten even worse, if truth be told.
Exactly, it's all relative, right? Yeah. But and not only that, I mean, there's a reason I think why terrorist groups have grown. And we've also seen Salafi groups growing on the Egyptian street and in Jordan. So a lot of these very conservative or radical or even violent groups have grown over the last 20 to 30 years in the Arab world. And I think we have to have a very serious conversation about why that's happened. So clearly, American policy hasn't created this great Middle East. No, if anything... we have to remember,
I agree completely that there are trends in the Middle East that are troubling, but I think I would parse it out a little differently. I think that there are a number of seriously weak states in the Middle East. I think of Yemen, I think of Lebanon, and I think of Iraq, and to some extent we had a role, enormously in Iraq in weakening that state. But I think of other states in the Middle East which are they're not democratic and they're not particularly pretty, but they're relatively strong states. States that control their territory, that can control their population. An Egypt, a Jordan, a Saudi Arabia, a Syria, kind of on the other side of the ledger in terms of American policy. But these are places where you can deal with a government and you can pretty much expect that government to be able to follow up its decisions and enforce its law. Now, I think the big question is, does the political stagnation in the Middle East and the economic stagnation in many of these places. And again, we have to parse this out, right? Because in the oil states, there's no economic stagnation. Things are actually going very, very well. But let's focus on Egypt, which is the key to all of this, I think. Right? You have some economic growth in Egypt and some interesting pockets of economic dynamism, but yeah, it's not keeping up with population growth. So the question is, would a more open and democratic Egyptian government be able to deal with these issues in a more effective way and thus avoid a massive revolution? And that to me is the key long-term, short-term trade-off for the U.S. Obviously, I think something like the Iranian Revolution, I think the Iranian Revolution was probably the worst thing for American interests in the post-World War II Middle East, right? And that's not something that we can control. That's a domestic upheaval. If you had a domestic upheaval like that in Egypt, it would throw off American interests in all sorts of ways. But that's the
Iranian.
Right, go ahead.
I mean, the Iranian Revolution is an interesting example because we had the same view. So in the 70s, Carter and the people around him thought that this was an island of stability, that the Shah's Iran would continue to be the way it was and be a strong pillar of the Middle East order. But we got caught by surprise, and look what happened, because we assumed that these regimes could stay in power forever, but they don't. And it's certainly possible that could happen in Egypt, that yes, we think the Mubarak regime is stable, that Egyptians don't have a penchant for violence in the streets and popular uprising and all of that. But I think what a lot of people say about Egypt, and to be fair, they've been saying it for a long time, but I think there's some truth to it, is that Egypt is getting close to the boiling point, and at some point, sooner or later, it might really explode. But the problem is we can't really anticipate that. And so we have to, I think, take preemptive action.
Well, my problem with the preemptive action is this, that we're talking about...
Just to clarify to our readers, though, I don't mean preemptive action in the Bushian sense.
No, not in the military sense. I certainly don't think we should be invading Egypt in any way, shape, or form. But, the British and the French tried that in '56, didn't work very well. I think that my argument with that policy stance is that I grant you that revolutionary upheaval in Egypt would be enormously damaging for American interests, but it's a high impact, but I would argue a low probability event. And to me, pushing the Egyptians to open up their system, be more democratic, actually have real competitive elections, there's a much higher probability that we will have serious foreign policy problems with them if they become more democratic, because as you and I both agree, American policy in the region isn't very popular in Egypt, and thus a democratic Egyptian government would reflect that public opinion more directly. So to me, the trade-off is, do we take almost certain problems in our relations with Egypt and on Arab-Israeli issues in the short to medium term, in the hopes that in the long term, this rather low probability event, a big social revolution in Egypt, the probability would be reduced to zero. And that to me is the trade-off.
Well, here's the thing. But part of the reason that we're not popular, so this is a little bit circular, part of the reason we're not popular is because we don't support democracy in the Arab world. And the reason we don't support democracy in the Arab world is because we're not popular.
Right.
So at some point we got to break that cycle.
But I think
this is really one of the...
I think there's other stuff that makes us unpopular, right? It's not just the democracy thing. I think our Arab-Israeli stance, our military presences, the invasion of Iraq made us unpopular in lots of places, although surprisingly not as unpopular in a couple of other places. But I do think that if we think that democratic Arab states will be friendly to us because we support democracy, even though we continue our current policies on other issues, I think that would be a mistake as well. That I don't think that the democracy issue is the only thing that makes us unpopular.
Yeah, I think you're right. But let's play out for a second what a brotherhood government in Egypt might actually do.
Sure.
Because we do have other examples in the region where Islamists have come to power through free elections, and people initially were scared, but it hasn't turned out to be the end of the world, at least from a foreign policy standpoint. I mean, let's not forget that two of our closest allies in the Middle East are governed by what can be considered Islamist parties, and that's Iraq and Turkey.
Right.
And I think it's one of the great ironies that the Iraq invasion essentially, it made possible the first time an Islamist party has ever come to power through free elections in the Arab world. That was made possible by the Iraqi invasion.
Right. That's among the ironies of the Iraqi invasion.
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, so I think people had similar concerns about the Turkish Islamists when they come to power. You know, what are they going to do? They're going to break off the relationship with Israel. They're going to move away from the EU. And yes, maybe there's been a little bit of that. But Turkey today is still very much in the pro-Western orbit. It still has diplomatic relations with Israel and cooperates on a whole number of areas. So I think these predictions of, you know, Islamists overreaching and doing terrible things in foreign policy simply isn't borne out by the record.
Right, and I think on Turkey you're right. Of course, there's a debate in Washington right now. You know, have the Turks abandoned the West because of their relations with Iran and the dust-ups with Israel? But I tend to agree with you that I think the Justice and Development Party, the AK Party government in Turkey is is just fine for the United States in terms of foreign policy. At least so far, I don't see any problems there. I guess the difference I see is that the AK Party came to power in Turkey only after, about 2 decades worth of fits and starts, and the party was banned, and it had to compete against not just the secular parties, the Turkish nationalist parties, but an entrenched military and judiciary in Turkey that pushed it to move away from some of its earlier Islamist platforms. And it really, when you talk about the moderation of the Muslim Brotherhood parties in Egypt and Jordan, as you mentioned before, I think that the difference is that in Turkey, the Islamists had to push up against really powerful secular institutions and a substantial, though not majority, secularist political trend in the country. I think I don't see that in Egypt and Jordan, right? And I mean, in Egypt, the military is the regime, and if the regime changes, the military presumably will have a much reduced role in politics. Although that would be up for grabs. Obviously, that would be a really interesting thing to see. In Jordan, the institution is the monarchy, and would the monarchy push against the Islamist? It's an open question.
Yeah, so I think there's ways to sort of replicate the Turkish model in kind of creative ways. So, for example, you could have a situation where the Brotherhood in Egypt is in government, but the military is still somewhat autonomous and sort of sees itself as the guardian of the Egyptian polity. Or in Jordan, that you have an Islamist prime minister, but the monarchy is still led by a somewhat secular progressive person like King Abdullah today. I mean, there's a way to kind of envision a sharing of power between these different sectors of society. But we also have to think about institutions. So if we're worried about Islamist overreaching when they come to power, let's create or support the creation of institutions that constrain Islamist power. So for example, in Egypt, it would be better to have a parliamentary system rather than a presidential system. Because at least in a parliamentary system, if Islamists won an election, let's say they won 30% of the vote, that's not enough to form a government. So they have to join forces with liberal and leftist groups to form a majority coalition. And that coalition would constrain them, because if they started to overreach, the liberals would leave.
Right.
So I think there's ways to think about institutions in a way that can help us constrain the accumulation of power.
Right. Well, that gets into electoral systems, which is a fascinating issue, because, in fact, under a first-past-the-post system, which is not the Egyptian system, but it's kind of similar to the Egyptian system, where, as I understand it, the top 2 vote-getters get the 2 seats in each district. 30% of the vote might give you a majority in parliament, right? Depending upon how the other forces shake out. I mean, certainly we see a Hamas. We saw in the 06 elections, right? A solid Hamas majority in the Palestinian legislature, even though Hamas didn't get 50% of the votes of the total
Right.
votes cast. So electoral systems
Right.
play a role here.
They really do matter, yeah. And that's why I think if we have to go beyond sort of our traditional democracy promotion approach and think more seriously about, what will Egypt and Jordan look like 20, 30 years down the road, and how can we help create strong institutions that are more representative and address some of these concerns ahead of time.
Yeah, let me push you on this, though, because it seems to me that this kind of electoral engineering and really political engineering would entail an even more intrusive American role in these places than we already have. And I guess I'd put forward the idea that our track record's not good at that. We tend to screw up because, we're ham-handed. We don't know these societies that well. I mean, Iraq is kind of exhibit A on this. We went in militarily, and I'm not saying that you're advocating going in militarily in Egypt and Jordan, of course not. But
Right.
but the more we get involved in this, the more chances we have to screw it up. And I kind of don't trust Washington to do the right thing on this.
To be honest, I don't either, but I think there's so much at stake here that we don't really have a choice. Because I think at the end of the day, and I'd like to pose this to you, I mean, autocracies don't last forever.
Mm-hmm.
They're not going to be a permanent solution in the Arab world. So sooner or later, the current order will be replaced by something else. I suppose you could make the argument that the Arab world could be permanently authoritarian, but then you'd have to make a very odd historical argument that every other region in the world has had democratic transitions, but there's something truly unique about the Arab world that makes that impossible. And that's a very tenuous argument, I think, to be making. So based on that, I think we should expect it to happen sooner or later. The question is, do we want to wait indefinitely? Do we want to be on the right side of history, the wrong side? Do we want to play a role in shaping these institutions as they evolve? Or do we want to be caught by surprise, similar to the Iranian Revolution?
Right.
So I don't think there's alternatives. So I think everything you're saying is right, that it's risky, it's messy, there's a lot of uncertainty, we might have to play a more intrusive role. But I think there's only two choices, autocracy or something more democratic. Mm-hmm. And autocracy is not going to last forever.
Right.
Yeah.
And I would certainly agree. And I want to follow up on this after I make the policy argument on this idea that the Arab world is exceptional. And I don't agree that it's exceptional in any cultural way, that it's somehow resistant to democracy in some strange way that other parts of the world are not. I mean, we do have to explain Arab exceptionalism in the democratic wave. It's the only place that really hasn't seen a big democratic wave in the last 30 years. But I think that we can do it without talking about big cultural issues. But on the policy side, I guess I take the point that nothing lasts forever. But if we're talking about a timeline of 5 years for these autocratic regimes that are pro-American, then I would say, yeah, we gotta change everything we're doing. But if you're talking about a 20 or 25 year timeline, which is not unreasonable because these regimes have lasted for quite a while. Let's face it, the Egyptian regime, I would date the beginning of the current Egyptian regime to 1952. So it's the second half of a century, and one can argue the Jordanian regime is even older than the Egyptian regime. Yeah. So if you're talking 25 years, then it seems to me that the kind of stand pat policy option makes more sense, because who knows what's going to happen in 25 years. I would assume, and frankly I would hope, that we would be less interested in the Middle East. We as a country, the United States, would be less interested and certainly less intrusive in the Middle East than we are now. But that's down the road. But let me get back to this really interesting question about Arab exceptionalism, which I think deserves a couple of minutes of comment. There is an argument out there, which we both know, and I think it's associated to some extent with the eminent Princeton University historian Bernard Lewis, particularly in his writings before September 11th, that there's a cultural block in Islam to the development of democracy. And the argument in very, very short form goes something like this. Islam has a system of law and that thus you don't need democracy because you have divine law, the Sharia, and that thus there is a cultural blockage to the idea that human beings should make their own decisions. And frankly, one can see this argument in Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda makes this argument all the time, right? That democracy is an innovation, it's un-Islamic, it places man in the place of God as the legislator, and that is polytheism. It's awful. It's the worst thing you can have in Islam. But to me, the counter argument is that Arabs like democracy. When they have real elections, and there have been some real elections, and even quasi-real elections, they turn out in huge numbers to vote. They turn out in numbers much higher than we Americans turn out to vote. And in every public opinion poll I've seen, there's a desire for democracy. You know, I'm sure people define it different ways. You ask a Salafi Islamist what democracy means, and you ask a former communist who's now a liberal what democracy means. They'd have different ideas, but the idea of democracy is extremely popular. I don't really see a cultural block to it.
No, and I agree with you, and it's really remarkable to see some of the polling figures. We're talking anywhere between 80 to 90% support for democracy, and there are elections that I personally wouldn't really vote in because they don't really make much
they don't
of a
make
difference.
Any difference. Yeah.
Yeah, but for example, in Bahrain, and we maybe talk about that a little bit later. But in Bahrain, you had recent elections where 67% of Bahrainis voted, which is remarkable. We can talk about the first Iraqi elections post-invasion, where over 50% voted.
Even though there was a Sunni boycott by the Sunnis.
And also because, they were braving terrorist threats to go out there and vote for the first time in their lives. That's pretty remarkable, and that shows a real willingness to embrace democracy. That said, I think there is at least one caveat to this: is they might support democracy, but that doesn't mean it's a liberal it's liberal democracy, and I think we have to make that distinction. And if in some of these same polls, you see widespread support for Sharia being the only or the main source of legislation in incredible numbers. There's actually, I have some of the polling numbers here. There's, according to the Arab Barometer, 79.8% of Jordanian respondents agree or strongly agree that government should implement only the laws of Sharia.
Wow.
So, and I think that's similar across the board in a lot of these countries, possibly with the exception of Morocco and Lebanon.
Right. That's like 4 out of 5 dentists recommend Trident. I mean, that's huge numbers.
Yeah. So I think we have to recognize that these are deeply conservative societies, and we have seen a really remarkable shift, where if we look 30, 40 years ago, it would be extremely rare to see a woman in the street wearing the headscarf. Now when you go to Egypt, 80 or 90% of Muslim women are covering their hair. So there has really been this continuous shift. But it's interesting that shift has gone along with the embrace of democracy. Because if you look at the 80s, Islamists weren't comfortable using that word. They actually only used the word shura, and they considered, and I'm talking about mainstream peaceful Islamists. So they went through a reorientation over time where they came to terms with these so-called Western ideas, and that goes for most of these populations. And you'd think that the Bush administration would have tainted the word democracy, but we haven't really seen any dimming of support for democracy as an aspiration, as an idea.
Shadi, let me press you though on this point, and I'll play devil's advocate here.
Sure.
If you look at Iran, right, the Iranian Revolution had kind of two elements in it in terms of its constitutional structures, right? It had an Islamist, a particularly Shia Islamist notion of wilayat al-faqih, the rule of the jurist, that was tailor-made for Khomeini, but has been inherited by Khamenei, right? And then it had a democratic element, had an elected parliament, had an elected president, and we seem to see now the kind of the clash of those two elements within the Iranian political system. to the benefit of the if you will, the more theocratic element of the Iranian constitution. I'm not getting into the old question, did Ahmadinejad get 50% or more or whatever.
Right.
We certainly see kind of a downgrading by the current Iranian regime of the democratic element, of the popular participatory element, of the parliamentary element of the system, and an upgrading of the I'll call it the more theocratic element, although that's a difficult that's a problematic term, but we'll shorthand it that way. So do you see that same kind of tension in the Muslim Brothers? Do you see that same kind of tension in other Islamist parties like the PJD in Morocco, the Party of Justice and Development in Morocco? How do you read that?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big difference here, and that's why I think the Iranian case isn't very instructive for the Arab world, because we're talking about a different political tradition, the Shia tradition. If we look at the Brotherhood or the PJD in Morocco, we're talking about groups that aren't very comfortable with clerical institutions. They don't get along very well with the clerical leadership. Most of the leaders themselves are not clerics. They have no formal religious education. They're largely professionals, engineers, lawyers, doctors, journalists, you name it. So in that sense, it's sort of odd. In the Sunni world, you have the traditional Sunni clerical establishment, which is more or less, accepting of the status quo.
And institutionally tied to the state in most cases.
Exactly. And these regimes have done a very good job of appropriating religious institutions and really exerting influence. For example, in Egypt, Al-Azhar, one of the great seats of Islamic learning in Islamic history, was essentially taken over by the Egyptian state, and it has very little independence now. So in that sense, Islamists in the Arab world have seen themselves going against that, and very rarely have they advocated for a clerical role in government. And sometimes they actually argue for the opposite. For example, the Brotherhood in Egypt, in its most recent political program, argues that Al-Azhar should be independent from the state, and they should be able to elect their own leadership as an institution. And in some sense, that's secularism in its traditional definition, the idea of separation between church and state, or in this case, mosque and state. So I think that's an interesting distinction.
But I take your point completely that there does seem to be this different trend in the Shia world, where you have leaders like Hassan Nasrallah of Hezbollah who are clerics, and among Sunni Islamists who they tend not to be clerics. But for example, the Brotherhood in Egypt does, when they put out their platform recently, right, a couple of years ago, there was this issue about whether there was going to be a quote unquote kind of Supreme Court that would judge the Islamic basis of laws and be able to overturn laws. And so I think there still is that tension there that is inevitable. As you say, these are not liberal movements, and I think most Americans should, maybe don't realize that in at least some parts of the Arab world, more democratic governments on an issue that, say, for Americans has kind of a high profile, which is women's rights issues, that some more democratic governments in the Arab world might be less friendly to what we would consider to be kind of liberal women's rights issues than authoritarian regimes would be.
Yeah, and I think you're definitely right about that. That there would potentially be that trade-off, and you're right that the Brotherhood did talk about an advisory council that would kind of look at laws. There's some debate about what they meant exactly, but so I think this gets to a bigger point, and that is most Muslims. And I'm a little bit hesitant to overgeneralize, right. So I'll just kind of put that disclaimer out. But if we compare Islam to other religions, there's more support among Muslims for religion to play a larger role in public policy.
Right.
And I think in some sense you could even make the argument, and maybe I'm about to make it right now, that in some sense Muslims, at least at this current time, are somewhat immune to secularization. Secularization doesn't seem to be working. It generally hasn't worked in the Arab world. So I think for people who are sort of waiting out for a quote unquote enlightenment
right,
in
for the Reformation,
world, they might have
Reformation to hit.
The Reformation. Yeah. They might have to wait a very, very long time. And it's not entirely clear to me whether a European-style enlightenment is even possible theoretically in the Arab world, and that gets into
right, and even in terms of the more kind of narrow, less philosophical issue of the Islamization of society. I think you certainly you identify, the fact that societies have become more Islamized in the last 30 years. There's no question about that in terms of social life.
Again, part of that self-determination. If the majority of Muslims want to be more Islamized, and if the majority of Muslims don't want to become liberals the way we want them to become liberals, I don't think we can force them along a different path. And at some point, we have to come to terms with that reality that we can't deal with the ideal Muslim world. We're dealing with the Muslim world as it is. And for whatever historical reasons, or, we can go back a long time, Islam has developed in a certain way that makes it much harder to separate the religious from the political. Right. To the extent that I think the whole kind of act of distinguishing between them is a very Western thing in the first place. Right. I think in the Arab world, the two are so intertwined, it doesn't really even make sense to talk about a distinction in some cases.
Yeah. Let me get us back to that question that we kind of started this latest tangent on, which is the lack of democracy in the Arab world, this exceptionalism, where every other world region has seen since the 80s a democratic wave, whether it be Latin America, East Asia, certainly Eastern Europe, and even Sub-Saharan Africa in many cases. The Arab world, not the Muslim world, we should be clear about. Plenty of Muslim
right.
states have had democratic revolutions and democratic reforms, but the Arab world hasn't really seen that, right? The only places that you could call even quasi-democratic right now in the Arab world would be Iraq and Lebanon, and they're not exactly models people would like to follow, I think, in their politics. So why do you think that the Arab world, and we've kind of agreed that it's not Islam per se or culture, why do you think the Arab world has kind of missed out on this third wave of democratization?
Yeah, well, I think, I don't like, as we were talking about earlier, I don't think it's cultural or anything. I think the reason is actually somewhat more straightforward than people assume. I think it has a lot to do with the role of international factors, and particularly the role of Western powers. Mm-hmm. And I think generally in most other regions, the West has at least eventually supported democratic development. It took them some time in Latin America, but eventually they came around to it.
Right.
And if we're looking at the colored revolutions in Eastern Europe, we see the West playing a critical role in making those set of outcomes possible. But I think what's distinctive about the Arab world is that the U.S. has played almost the opposite role,
and not just the U.S., Europe too. I mean, I think if you look at North Africa, it's the European countries, the EU, and specifically the French that have had more influence on this. But I agree.
Yeah, the French.
I agree completely. But it seems to me that the reason that is the case is that in every other world region, the United States saw its major opponent as the left, kind of the Cold War, right? And that when the Cold War ended, kind of mid-'80s, when it became clear, even before the Soviet Union collapsed and or even the Berlin Wall came down, it became clear that the left wasn't going to be a global competitor to the American model of democratic capitalism. But in the Middle East, the competitor is not the left, right? The competitor to authoritarianism is Islam, right? It's the groups that say Islam is the solution, and that I think is the reason that the United States has been much more supportive of authoritarianism in the region than in other places. I also think that there's another factor, and that's oil. I think that the oil wealth of so much of that region allows regimes to sustain authoritarianism, whereas in other areas, fiscal crisis or changing world economies might actually lead to regime crisis and democratization. I mean, it's interesting to contrast Turkey to the Arab states on this, right? Because Turkey had this goal to get into the EU, right? And to be in the EU, you had to be democratic. And so lots of the social basis of the AK party in Turkey, those kind of Anatolian businessmen, they're Islamists, but they want to be in the EU too. And so they were encouraging of democracy. If we could hold out that kind of long-term goal, maybe we could encourage more local support for democratization, particularly in the business communities. But because of our strategic interest in oil, because of the relations with Israel, and because of the fear that Islamists would damage those things, America hasn't been willing to do that, and neither has the EU, for that matter.
Yeah, I mean, certainly. Those two things are very connected: the fear of Islamists coming to power, and also the issue that oil is there. So yeah, I mean, you're right, but that doesn't change the fact that still I think it helps us to understand why the Arab world has been exceptional in this regard. And if you look back at Algeria in 1991, 1992,
which is a really just for our listeners, that's a really important case, I think, because there you've got an authoritarian government that has a fiscal crisis. Oil prices had collapsed in the late 80s. And the president says, okay, we're going to have real elections. We're going to have free elections. And the Islamist party, called the FIS, the Front Islamique du Salut, the Islamic Salvation Front, won a majority of the seats in the first round of the French-style two-round elections. And then the army stepped in to put an end to the process. And it began a horrific civil war, right? Over 100,000 people killed.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's such an important case. And it's unfortunate that not more Americans are aware of Algeria in 1991. Because if you talk to Arabs today, and particularly Islamists, the ghost of Algeria is still very much there, even though it happened almost 2 decades ago. That here was one of the most promising democratic experiments the region had seen. And then when it was about to happen, the Western powers and the French particularly played a major role here, essentially supported a military coup. And sometimes I wonder if we could sort of undo history and try again with Algeria. Maybe the region would have turned out in a different way if we had one promising case to look at. Let's say the Islamists, they were governing there, they were becoming more moderate, there was sharing of power with the secular military. I mean, I wonder if we could have avoided a lot of the problems that we're seeing today. And it's really tragic considering the number of lives lost over the subsequent 10 years.
It's an interesting what if. And I've always thought that the United States on the Algeria case was, we were following the French unnecessarily. Because it seems to me the further away from kind of the core Arab-Israeli geographical area of the Middle East you get, the less concerned America should be about Islamists coming to power. I mean, I understand for people in Washington, for whom the Egyptian and Jordanian peace treaties with Israel are a core success of American foreign policy in the Middle East, trying to square this circle of our close relationship with Israel with our desire to have good relations with the Arab world for economic reasons and for strategic reasons. Putting them at risk is a difficult prospect to face. But Algeria, I mean, that's way far away. Why not give it a try? Why not have an experiment that way? But the French didn't feel the same way. That's for sure. I know we're getting close to the end of our hour. I want to push you, bring it back to kind of current policy stuff, and ask you kind of a flat out question on which I'm sure we'll disagree, at least some, and that would be a good way to end things off. So we've got an Egyptian election coming up, and it's going to be a sham. The Muslim Brotherhood is participating, but nobody has any thought that this is an election that could actually return an opposition majority to the Egyptian parliament. Right? It's just not going to happen.
Right.
So should the United States use its enormous aid lever on Egypt? Right? We give the Egyptians about $1.5 billion a year in aid. We have every year since the signing of the Camp David Treaty with Israel. Should we start playing hardball with that aid with the Mubarak regime and saying, look, we're just, we're going to cut it. We're going to cut it a third. We're going to cut it 50% unless you take, unless you hit these certain kind of indicators of democratization.
Yeah, I think we have to put serious pressure on the Egyptian regime over the course of the next year. This is a very crucial time for Egypt, with President Mubarak likely passing away over the next year to year and a half due to his
not that we hope that
health condition.
Not that we
no,
hope that.
No, we're not saying that.
La qadr Allah, la qadr Allah, la qadr Allah, as they say in the Middle East.
Yes, yeah. So this is going to be a real period of uncertainty for Egypt. And I think a lot of people, maybe they're not anymore because they've lost hope, but we're looking to the U.S. for to play a role, to have something to say, to take a stand. And we've seen so little of that. And it's just, and this goes to a whole issue of this disappointment with the Obama administration that I think is spreading throughout the Arab world. But we don't have a strategy. We're not thinking in a strategic way about what's going to happen to Egypt after Mubarak passes away. And it's not just Egypt. I mean, this is actually, in some sense, the year of interesting elections, or maybe not so interesting elections for that matter.
I think your foreign policy piece said not so interesting elections, right?
Yeah, so I mean, in that foreign policy piece, a couple weeks ago, I made this argument that, we're seeing an interesting model, the rise of free but meaningless elections. So in Bahrain and Jordan, and those two elections just happened over the course of the past month or so, we saw elections that were reasonably free. Yeah. People went out, they voted. There wasn't widespread allegations of fraud and so on. But the elections don't matter in any real sense, because let's say in Jordan, for example, no matter who's in parliament, in the lower house of parliament, the upper house, which is all appointed, can block any initiative that comes from the lower house.
Same thing in Bahrain.
And even if the same thing in Bahrain, and even if that's not the case, you have a monarchy that is able, again, to veto anything they don't like. So these elections are elections for parliamentary bodies that have very little influence or power. Yeah. And this goes into, an issue that I talk about in the article, that my worry is that the opposition, the Arab world, is losing faith in elections as a mechanism for change. And they're going to say, forget about it. We tried elections for the last 15, 20 years. It didn't get us anything. Let's start to look at alternative methods of contestation. Right. And, I'm worried about what that might mean.
Right. And I think, just to get back to the policy debate, I agree with you that I think that this could be a very tenuous period in Egyptian political history, as we might get a leadership transition sometime soon. And to me, that argues for not pushing too hard right now, and if truth be told, I'm not for pushing on the democracy front much at all. But I do think that this issue of will Islamist and other opposition groups who have tried the democratic path, who've tried elections, will they become so fed up with them that they take, as you said, other paths of contestation, which would be violent opposition to the regime. And I think,
I don't mean exactly violence. Right. That's certainly possible. Right. I hope that's not the case. But we can also look at mass protests, civil disobedience, election boycotts, putting people into the streets. Right.
So politics in the streets.
Yeah.
And I think, and these regimes, and here's the big distinction, and we probably have to end up fairly soon on this point, because we're coming up on our hour. But to me, the big distinction in the Arab world right now is between relatively strong states in terms of their hold over domestic society and relatively weak states. And in relatively weak states, people can take to the streets or contest the state for power in a place like Lebanon. In a strong state like Syria or in Jordan or in Saudi Arabia or in Egypt, it's a lot harder to do that. And that makes, it's an authoritarian result. There's no question about that. But it makes these kind of alternative means of contestation that much harder. And it seems to me, at least so far, that if you look, say, at the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood, they're still willing to play the electoral game, even though they know that the gains to be gained from it are very limited. And I find that both an interesting choice and somewhat encouraging. But, of course, that's not the only option. The Jordanian Muslim Brotherhood boycotted the the Jordanian election, and parts of the Shia community in Bahrain boycotted the election, although not particularly successfully given the turnout there. It's an interesting mix, to be sure.
Yeah, and I think you're right that, Egyptians and other Arabs have been hesitant to go out into the streets in large numbers precisely because there's fear of a strong state. But I think it's an interesting question that, let's say that does happen during a period of uncertainty in Egypt after Mubarak dies, for instance, and you have 50,000 people in the middle of Cairo protesting for democratic change, and the regime really cracks down, maybe even shoots into the crowd. What is the Obama administration's response going to be?
Right.
Are they going to feel forced at that point to take an actual pro-democracy stand, or will they just continue to side with the regime and express concern?
Right. That's
so. I think there may very well come a time, whether it's this term or the next term, where the Obama administration is going to have to be a little bit more clear about how much it's willing to push these governments. And I'm not talking about, we don't have to talk about cutting aid or doing anything drastic. That's not what we're talking about here. But just at least put some pressure on the regime to allow more space for the opposition, to make some at least modest improvements in the electoral system. I mean, there are things that we can do and that we can push on. And not just in private, because people always say, well, there are private deliberations and discussions and all that. But we have to show the Arab world that we're willing to speak out publicly and take a stand. And when Obama or Secretary Clinton meet with their Egyptian counterparts, to make this a major part of their bilateral discussions. And we haven't seen that yet.
Right. My problem with that, of course, is we can talk, but if we don't do anything, then we're hypocrites, right? Then we lead people on to think that we're going to promote these things, and then we don't do it. And I think that's a real problem. I think the Bush administration had that problem. It talked a lot and did a little bit and certainly had an effect pushing in Lebanon, pushing in Egypt. But then as soon as Hamas got elected, it backed off. And so we face the hypocrisy problem if we talk and don't do. But I think we're getting to the end of our hour. So I'm going to wish you an Eid Mubarak. Eid al-Adha. Eid al-Adha is on Wednesday the 16th.
Greg, Egyptians aren't saying Eid Mubarak anymore. At least those in the opposition, they don't want to bring up Mubarak's name, and so there's maybe Eid Baradai.
Eid Baradai. There we go. We should tell our viewers. Eid Mubarak just means a blessed Eid. The word Mubarak means blessed, and Hosni Mubarak has certainly been to some extent blessed in his ability to hold on to power in Egypt. But Eid Mubarak is what you say to people on the holidays, and since Eid al-Adha is coming up, Eid Mubarak to all our Muslim viewers, and a happy Thanksgiving to everybody in the U.S.
Okay.
Thanks, Shadi.
I really enjoyed the conversation.
Me too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.